So welcome, guys. This is our first workshop of the Spark Writing Festival in its virtual format. Thank you all for joining us this evening. I am so very excited to be able to present to you Melissa Yes, who is a writer and an artist. So she teaches here at UAB, and Melissa Yes is an intermediate artist who tinkers with the cultural deconstruction of American bodies, landscapes, and value systems. A conceptually driven and project-based artist, Yes works in painting and sculpture alongside video, installation, and other extended media. Her moving image pieces treat digital video like a physical material that she manipulates and layers to emphasize the medium itself. Layers, glitches, and multi-channel presentations in Yes's videos emphasize the pleasure and power of destruction as a creative process. Recent works include Pressure, a short screen dance created in collaboration with Fen Kennedy, Matt Reynolds, and students from the University of Alabama Department of Theater and Dance. Yes keeps her studio in Birmingham, Alabama, where she is an active member of the art community, working as an educator at the University of Alabama, Birmingham, and as co-director of a contemporary nonprofit, Vinegar. So that being said, I'm gonna turn it over to you, Melissa. Thank you.
Thank you, Haley. It's an honor to be here. And I admit I feel a little bit sheepish speaking to a bunch of writers because I really, at this point, am an artist first. Although I came into art by a sort of circuitous route. I went to school for biology and found later that I was not satisfied with the career that I was going to go down in that path. So I came back to school at UAB again, met Haley, and got a degree in art, and realized that writing was really important to me in my process of understanding why I make art, what I make art about, and why, etc. And so I'm assuming most of the people in the virtual room tonight identify as writers of some kind. I don't know if any of you also identify as visual artists, but I'm going to present to you a little conundrum that all of us visual artists face at some point, because I actually think that it applies to all creatives, and that is writing about our work. Now, the talk tonight is going to go into, it's going to be like part art history, part having fun, and an arc of a workshop. But writing about one's work is a really difficult challenge. I find personally that it's really easy to write about a single project. Like this is about, I'm dealing with this really specific thing that I'm investigating and I'm using these materials, and it's really straightforward. But often when I pull back and I take all these different projects that I've done, or for you, maybe all these different pieces that I've written, it's like, what is the overarching thing that I do? I can get stumped sometimes. And actually, Poor Haley had to read what was my artist statement a few months ago. And I update my artist statement constantly. And so I'm gonna share my screen here. It's gonna be a little clunky because I'm gonna do this special screen share where I only share part of my screen. So if at any point any of you think you're supposed to be seeing something that you're not seeing, just let me know and I'll move my screen around. So give me a moment here. Share some advanced. Of screen. Okay, now you can probably see I see a nod. So this is my artist statement now. It's a little different than what Haley just read. And I don't really show this to you to dig into my own work, but to give you an example of the way I think about writing artist statements as actually part of a practice. So, you know, I tend to work in big projects. So I tend to do one big project a year, maybe one big project every 2 years, and maybe some accessory smaller projects on the side. So every time something new has been done, I think, what is it that I'm actually doing as an artist? And so my new statement still has a lot of what you heard Haley say, but it also sort of sharpened it down a little bit. And this last sentence I'm going to dwell on later, but I embrace copying, degradation, and recombination of physical and digital media. So there are a lot of like multi-syllabic words in my artist statement, but this is actually sort of honed down from something that had words like hegemony in it. And readability is not just for the person reading your artist statement. I think it's also for you. So if I have to stumble over the words in my own artist statement, then maybe I need to revise it and speak in actual English and not what we will call international art English. But we're going to get into that later. So little tweaking here. Bear with me. Okay. So I'm actually going to start with all of you to do a little activity. So you can do this on your computer, on a notepad, whatever. You can mute yourself and dictate it into your phone. Do whatever works for you. But without referring to what you've already written about yourself, because I trust that most of you probably already have written a statement about your work. I just wanted you to take a moment. We're going to take like 4 or 5 minutes. I just want you to write a paragraph summarizing your work as it is today, not last year, not last month. What you do as a maker today. Okay, I'm seeing a number of heads kind of coming up from the desk. So if you're still writing, go for it. But I'm going to move on just to kind of keep the flow going. So I'm popping a link into the chat if you want to click on that. I'm also going to take us here. So there's a website called 500letters.org. I'm using this despite the fact that we have this sort of binary gender identifier here up top. Anybody who doesn't identify as she, her, or he, him, I apologize that this tool that I'm using does not represent you. That's a problem, but the tool is meant to sort of be a learning exercise for those of us who like to write about our work or have to write about our work. So this tool you can do on your own. You can click all the things and say, what do you work in? Click a few keywords and generate artist text. And what you find is actually a pretty convincing artist statement. This is my cat, Lizzie. She's helping us. And we'll come back to this again later, but I want us to think about to what degree our writing about our work can go beyond this funny tool. So we're going to come back to this. So forget that you're thinking about your own art for a moment. You've done that exercise, you've had it in your mind, but we'll put that aside for now. And think about how art and language have been used in tandem throughout art history. Because that actually, I think, can help us think about the way that we use art and language together, or how art can inform the language we use and the approaches that it takes to semiotics. So many of us are probably familiar with this image. This is not a pipe. This image is called The Treachery of Images by René Magritte, and it was made in 1928 and 29. And what's interesting is this work really predates a lot of what we consider conceptual art, which we'll get into in a minute, which was a few decades after this. But the trick here with this artwork is that, of course, it's not a pipe, right? It's a painting of a pipe. So it's a reminder that the thing that you're looking at and the idea that it conveys are two very different things. Like a pipe is an idea. You can have a physical, actual pipe in your hand. You can have an image of a pipe. You also can have this word pipe. None of these things is a pipe, right? None of these things that we're looking at on this image are a pipe. So this begins a nice trajectory of artists really thinking about pulling away from this idea of this illusory truth, right? Like, this is not a pipe that you're looking at. We're not looking into a window in which there's an actual pipe. Whereas throughout the Renaissance and most of Western art history, the idea was to sort of present this sort of picture of reality. The more realistic image looked, the more lifelike it was, the better the art it was, right? The more fleshy a piece of marble sculpture looks, the better art it is. It's like idea of reality being brought into new form. But this image reminds us that this is not a pipe. This is not reality. This is, it's just a painting. Very good one. So this is an artist, Jasper Johns. Many of you have probably heard of Jasper Johns. This is one of his more famous artworks called Three Flags. It was created in 1958, just a few decades after This Is Not a Pipe, Treachery of Images. So in this image, Johns, without using actual words, is doing a similar thing that René Magritte did in The Treachery of Images, in that if it were just one flag, one could believe that it was meant to be this sort of illusory presentation of a flag. But instead, we have this layering and scaling where we're beginning to actually recognize that it's a design and it's an idea and it's a motif that's being repeated. And it's not so much about it being a flag as it is about being a design, a flat image, and paint, right? So the same sort of conceptual relationship between the image and the language is still at play here, even though the text is not present physically, except in the title. Titling of artworks is a whole area where artists play with language. So here we come to conceptual art. I mentioned this before at the beginning, where we talked about Magritte sort of predating conceptualism. But so conceptual art was this moment where artists realized you can actually create an artwork without actually making an object. So this piece by Joseph Kosuth called 1 and 3 Chairs from 1965 is a really great example of conceptual art. And it does the same sort of thing that The Treachery of Images does, in that it presents a real chair physically in the space, a photograph of that chair, and a definition of chair, right? And none of these things is the Platonic chair, but they all reach for this sort of conceptual idea. So the concept of chair is the subject of this artwork. The chair itself isn't really the artwork, the image, the photograph isn't the artwork. The artwork is the concept, and thus we have the term conceptual art. But of course, interestingly, there are material components of this, right? So even though the content of the artwork is a concept, we still have this touchstone in physical space, and that it does include language. So once again, we're being presented language as sort of fact in comparison with other kind of fact. image, object, language, but then that last part of the artwork exists in this immaterial space of the idea. And it's in conceptual art where I think the relationship between language and visual art is really starting to get sussed out among the art community in a way that it hadn't ever been before. And that the idea becomes central to not only conceptual artists, but also artists working in all kinds of physical mediums. Even if they are painting flags, the emphasis is a little bit more on the concept and on how to touch on that concept without doing so in a sort of predictable, or shall I say, predictable way, or like, you know, beating you over the head with an idea, rather letting the structure and the way that the artwork exists in relation to its context and the relationship of the parts in the artwork really drives the meaning of the artwork into the conceptual space, where it's not just what exists visually, but also what exists conceptually. For instance, Robert Rauschenberg, who is a contemporary of Jasper Johns, is very, very well known for kind of messy, wonderful combines, he calls them, which are, he takes objects from the world and paint and combines them together to make these very textural objects and paintings. And he, you know, after some notoriety, you can play around a little bit, all right? So he sent this telegram that says, "This is a portrait of Iris Clert, if I say so," which is hilarious, right? And he can get away with that and be taken seriously in this gesture because of his notoriety and privilege, but it is still the same notion as this and this, that the concept, the assigning a name to a thing, assigning an idea to an object, transforms that object, right? So again, these are just some really inconspicuous, unimportant things until they're combined and presented to us in a way that an artist has said, there's a concept that is related to this, and all of a sudden that concept is what's transforming the object from something that is just a banal object to something that's causing me to question, you know, reality or something big like that. So this is just a very brief overview of how we've seen conceptual art and language creating a new path for visual art and writing to sort of come together in one. But that is one very specific trajectory, and that's not really where I want us to go here today, per se. Instead, I really want us to think about how artists specifically use language in the work itself. At the very beginning, we talked about writing about the work, and we're going to get back to that writing about the work. But in order to really help us think about that, let's think about how artists use language in the work itself and see how that can change our perspective. So writing is an action, right? It's something that we do with the body. It's something that takes an invisible or ideal concept and makes it physical in some way, whether it's a recorded speech, well, writing, you know, recorded speech, text that's written or typed. It gives form to a formless idea, right? And it does so through the body, whether through speech or through moving the hand. And so the act of doing this is not unlike lots of the acts of sort of performative painting, like we've seen in Jackson Pollock, who did the splatter paintings, that it is a mark of a gesture and a moment in time in which a human being was present with a material in a space. And one of the reasons I preface this with Bart Simpson is because this is probably one of my most favorite artworks of all time. It's by an artist called John Baldessari, and the title, as you can see, is "I Will Not Make Any More Boring Art." And he wrote it again and again and again and created a print of this. His first print, actually, and he did it, I think, in collaboration with the university, but then he realized there's something to this gesture. And so this has been repeated now as wallpaper that we can see in art spaces. It's an artwork, right? But it's text. So this was in like the early 70s, and Baldessari was really disillusioned with the state of painting that had come in the previous decade, because painting had really become sort of navel gazy. It's like paint was about paint, and painters were making paintings about paint, about painters, about history of painting. And he was getting a little bit annoyed with that. And this Baldessari had a great sense of humor too. So he actually burned many of his early landscapes and abstract paintings. And so by then he had pretty much abandoned the painterly conventions that he found pretty alienating, actually. And he started to make canvases using photographs and text like this. So in works like this, he demonstrates that his thinking at the time and is showing that he's sort of pushing towards conceptual art, although a little bit later than some of what we just saw. But it's a mantra, right? So this is an artwork, but it's also, I think of it almost like a ceremony that he put it out into the world publicly, saying, I'm declaring this now. I'm showing my commitment to this concept out as I move forward into the world, like getting married or declaring a religion or something like that. Like he said, I will not make any more boring art. He puts that out into the world as an artwork, not as a note, not as a description of his practice, but the art itself. So this is about the point, if I were giving a lecture to undergraduates, that I might have some sort of skeptical, scrunched eyebrows about, like, how the heck is this art, right? And could we all just sit here and scribble on some paper and say, this is art? Well, actually, yes, we could, because defining what art is a tricky business. And honestly, if any of us consider ourselves an artist of any kind and we make something and we call it art, then I suppose we all have to accept that that is art, right? But of course, this is canonized art. It's taken very seriously and is worth a lot of money, and et cetera, et cetera. So why is writing a simple sentence again and again art? Well, again, it has this connection to the gesture of the body, right? To make a paint stroke, to describe the form of somebody's velvet cape, is the same basic muscle gesture that you use to write the letter W in cursive, right? It's the same gesture. It just describes things differently. One of them describes something with visual illusion, and another one describes things with conceptual approximation, right? Each are an approximation. One is visual and one is conceptual. And so this one actually sort of makes the leap to that idea of the concept being the artwork a little bit more quickly, because it's taking something that is conceptual, which is language, right? And it's just going straight into that conceptual realm, whereas to create something illusory is still putting something that already exists into the world into a new sort of illusory form. So there's a different approach here that artists are increasingly taking seriously as a mode of making. Like this artist, Edgar Heap of Birds. This is a piece called Health of the People is the Highest Law. And he refers to these as paintings and drawings. He makes a lot of art that is text-based, but he doesn't call it writing, right? He doesn't call it signs. He calls them paintings and drawings. And I'll give you some time to read a few of these. So as we absorb the way that these visual artists are now taking to language as a form for their visual art, it's important to start noticing the aesthetic choices that are being made. With John Baldessari's piece, I Will Not Make Any More Boring Art, it is language in a very familiar format, handwritten on a piece of paper at the scale of the hand, right? This one is a little different, right? It's at the scale of the hand-painted sign. It's painted red with white text on top. It's messier. It's all caps, right? These are all formal choices that actually give the language itself new meaning. Imagine if this had been written in the same manner as this. How would the read change on that stuff, right? What if Baldessari's words, "I will not make any more boring art," were not that intimate cursive gesture, but they were all painted like this, right? That might seem kind of desperate, but whereas here, as he's speaking to issues that are far bigger than himself, it feels urgent, important, right? So in many ways, an artist like Edgar Heap of Birds can convey more by using text as painting than he could if he just used painting or just used text. The combination of the elements of visual art, the formal aspects of the color, scale, etc., blended with the ideal concepts that the language offers, allows a mixture of those two types of seeing and understanding what you're looking at. So I'll take you to another important piece. This is another text-based artwork called Warm Broad Glow. It's made in 2005 by the artist Glenn Ligon. It was his first ever neon piece. He's made numerous versions of this piece now. And of course, the work is very simple. In fact, I don't know this for sure, but I could guess to a degree of certainty that he probably did not physically make this. He probably conceived of this, decided formally what the typeface would look like, and probably had it manufactured. A lot of artists work in this way. So this notion, again, of the artist presenting a concept to the viewer instead of just crafting an object for the viewer is really coming forward. But of course, the phrase Negro Sunshine, one of the reasons, well, the main reason I'm showing you this is because it's a really important artwork, but another reason is that you literary types will enjoy the origin of this phrase. It was taken from Gertrude Stein's 1909 novel, 3 Lives. And she wrote in that novel, "Rose laughed when she was happy, but she had not the wide, abandoned laughter that makes the warm, broad glow of Negro sunshine." So it's a Gertrude Stein reference, and it's also an opportunity for a lot of powerful formal statements that he's making. So if we really dig in and look at what's happening, we are seeing him using these terms literally. So sunshine is used literally as light being emanated, and the color black is painted on the front part of this neon. So we don't see neon illuminated forward at us like we see a lot of neon conventionally in like signs out in the world, but instead we're seeing it backlit, and we're seeing both the dark and the light, right? And so he offers this to viewers, not just as text, but also as an object. And the material, nothing more than the material, the scale it takes, the way it's presented to you, the relationship to the body, that actually adds something to the language. And he used the same phrase again in a series of paintings, I guess we can call them, that are made with oil paint and what he calls coal dust. There's this material you can get at like Tractor Supply that's like really finely ground coal. It's very sparkly and black. It's very pretty. So he paints in oil and then he coats it in this coal dust. And it's the same text, but of course the way we read it is very different than the way we read it here, right? It doesn't feel quite as celebratory. It feels burdened and buried in a lot of literal grit, right? So this is an example of the way we think of how, the presentation of these words can really be transformed by very simple but powerful material choices. Keeping an eye on the time. We are going to get back to the workshop part, I promise, but this art history stuff is just part of the context. Really quick, I want to show you this video. Oh goodness. There's some weird stuff happening here. Hold on. So this is a piece by an artist named Anne Hamilton from 1994, and then she remade it in 1999. It's called ABC. And what we see here is a finger slowly erasing type. And then the video goes in reverse and we see what looks like the finger sort of miraculously printing this type. Of course, this recalls the connection of the body to language. And let me pull my notes up here. I find that Zoom is amazing, but also complicated. So she writes, how, in making present what is absent, does the practice of art articulate the joint between the joint between the word and the body as it links the scale of individual action to collective presence and social imagination? So again, the joint between the word and the body. Now, Anne Hamilton is an artist who knows how to articulate that joint very well, but other people I know who articulate that joint very well are poets, and I think I'm in good company here tonight. And that language can become visceral, right? And that's kind of where we're headed with this talk here today. So in the video, the most individuated mark of the body, the fingertip, dissolves the printed alphabet, its speech and sound, into the realm of touch. Now, without making a video artwork or a neon piece, I want us to start thinking about how we can make language feel more like touch. Another artist I want to quickly take a look at is Jenny Holzer. The abuse of power comes as no surprise is one of many truisms that she put out. She has a whole series of things she calls truisms, and this here on the left is a list of some of these. Abuse of power comes as no surprise. Alienation produces eccentrics or revolutionaries. Gosh, that's a very real statement right now. But these statements do not exist in the vacuum. They exist in context, right? So this is another way to think about how language can take on new meaning just by where and how it is placed. So in visual art, that's a physical placement of this statement, this truism, this artwork is placed in a location that's usually dedicated to, mass commercial advertisement, right? And so to recognize that power and then to make a statement about power in that same place is, that's part of the content of the work. So how can you do that in your writing? How can context take place on the page? I'm running out of time a little bit here, so I'm going to skip over the last one, but so I'm not going to have you watch this. But another way that artists use language is, of course, in pair with images, not just where we have a material conveying a meaning alongside some text, but as we saw in the very beginning here with Magritte, having an image and text together really goes a long way, because the image conveys things that are sometimes beyond the grasp of language or conveys something opposite, similar, etc., and juxtaposes what's being seen and what's being heard with language within the same moment of time. Now, we can't necessarily always do that in our writing, but I wanted to show you this. This is a video, by the way, and I'll send you, I'll put this link in here so you can all, this is a video by an artist named Hito Sterol, where the text and what we're seeing on the screen are both really, really important to what's happening, what the content of the work is. So all of this was just a quick survey of how mostly contemporary artists use language when they are when they use language not to describe the work, but use language as the work itself or as part of the work itself. To give you an idea of sort of the physicality, the materiality, and the relationship to the body that language can have. So activity part 2 is to retrieve that paragraph that you wrote at the beginning of the workshop and then recall this 500 letters website that I put up at the beginning, and I'll put in the chat again. And once we think about that, sort of how physical and visceral some of these presentations of text by artists feel, then we read an artist statement like this made up one from 500 letters. I don't know about you, but this feels very alienating, right? So take a look at what you wrote and see if it feels more like this, or if it feels more like a work of art that we saw in the presentation before. And then I want to introduce you to my friend, International Art English. International Art English is a term coined by a group called Canopy. And it's, well, I'll read to you a little bit. The internationalized art world relies on a unique language. Its purest articulation is found in the digital press release. This language has everything to do with English, but it is emphatically not English. It is largely an export of the Anglophone world and can thank the global dominance of English for its current reach. But what really matters for this language, what ultimately makes it a language, is the pointed distance from English that it is always cultivated. English that is always cultivated. So in what follows, and there's a whole essay about this, and I'll put that in the chat too, we examine some of the curious lexical, grammatical, and stylistic features of what we call International Art English. So you can take a look at that here later. The language we use for writing about art is oddly pornographic. We know it when we see it. No one would deny its distinctiveness, yet efforts to define it inevitably produce squeamishness, as if describing the object too precisely might reveal one's particular, perhaps peculiar, investments in it. So some of the linguistic features, they go into depth of them, but they start by saying that International Art English has a distinctive lexicon. Aporia, radically, space, proposition, biopolitical, tension, transversal, autonomy. An artist's work inevitably interrogates, questions, encodes, transforms, subverts, imbricates, displaces, though often it doesn't do these things so much as it serves to, functions to, or seems to, or might seem to do these things. You kind of get the point, right? So it's very easy sometimes when we are trying to pack a lot of information about what it is that we make art about into something as tight as an artist statement, to lean a little bit too heavily on words that we think are doing more heavy lifting than they're actually doing. So I present this to you to say, I am totally guilty of using International Art English. I try not to. I revise my statement often. There are some words that many of us just can't get around. Like, I'm just gonna have to use interdisciplinary all the time, and it's annoying and it embarrasses me, but it's the only way I can cram things down into one sentence where it could have been 3, right? So some of this obtuse use of language is useful, but there are points when it's not useful. So for instance, sometimes visual becomes visuality, global becomes globality, potential becomes potentiality, etc. Right? So when we're talking about the work that we make, whether it's visual art, writing, music, whatever it is that you do, when are we being generous to actually try and help people and ourselves understand what we're making? And when are we hiding behind language? So here's the rest of our activity for the night. So in your statement that you wrote at the beginning of the talk, were you speaking International Art English? You can ask that of yourself. You can share it in the chat if you want to, if there's something really embarrassing or just worth teasing out of your statement that you want to share in the chat. Feel free to. We can all be part of this together. Because I do think that visual artists are particularly guilty of International Art English. It's just part of the world that has been constructed around visual art. But I think that many of us, academics, creatives, etc., can easily fall into the trap of the language that does not serve us or our readers well. So if indeed you found yourself writing or speaking in international art English, let's try and improve upon that draft. So think first, if you were to turn your written statement into a piece of text-based visual art, like we saw in the talk here, what aesthetic choices would you make? What would the scale be? What would the materials be? What context would it exist in? What color would it be? What, etc. You know, think of all the different examples that we saw here and think to yourself, okay, if this were an artwork, how would I construct this? And go ahead and write that down for yourself. You want to come, Missy? Oh, big stretch. Good girl. Okay. And each of you probably works differently. Maybe some of you sketched this like as a drawing, or drawing and writing. What's the difference? Am I right? But maybe some of you used words to describe how you would make this artwork. And maybe you have more thinking to do. But again, I don't want to belabor it too long with my eye on the clock. But I'm curious if anybody would be willing to share some of the decisions they would have made to turn this into an artwork. You can just unmute yourself if would that work, Haley? Okay. And I'm sorry, I keep looking to the side. It's just that's where the faces are and it's instinct.
Okay, yeah, participants can unmute themselves now if you'd like to speak, or you can drop what you need to say in the chat box. I can say that I've been asked to do that before, like how would I be a visual representation? And I wound up actually incorporating the ampersand and the word and. It was a very small piece, but it had to deal with like coordinating conjunction. So like the link between two things. So that was, and it was in a used India ink, but I mixed it in with rubbing alcohol. So it actually like dissolved the particulates of the ink and sort of spread it out and everything like that. So you wound up getting like individual elements, but it was all linked together. It was a really fun piece to do. So Doug Bloss had me do that. You just learned so much in his classes.
He's so great.
Yes.
And I know that there have been a number of comments coming in, and I'm also like super pleased because I know a lot of these people. So hi. So we can get to questions at the end, but I just saw that Brandy, hi Brandy, wrote a note about the relationship to ekphrasis, and like ekphrastic poetry is a whole realm that I don't feel qualified to talk about, but this I was thinking about it when building this talk, and that how can you look at something and put it into another form, and that alchemy happens in our like summation of experiences and associations that we have in our individual perspectives, but it is very similar. It is very similar. Okay, and maybe we're feeling shy and we don't want to talk about how we would write our text using red clay or something, but I will just throw some stuff out, right? Because I'm like a material artist person, and halfway through this, there was a cat tail in my face. So it was like, would it be an image made out of like photoshopped cattails? Would it be smeared onto concrete with red clay? Would it take up the full size of a building? Would it be, printed as a fortune cookie note? What, like think about all the ways that we that we experience the tactile and visual world, and how the language that exists physically on your paper, but only by default, right? Not by sort of thinking that that's the specific option that you think is best for the presentation. How could it translate into that physical world, the way that artists, as we've seen here, are making that translation? And so then this is closer to the ekphrastic writing that Brandy mentioned. Review what you just listed, like what material, scale, color, and think about, if you look back at your writing, how can you change your word choices, tone, cadence, etc., to help the writing that you created approximate the physical attributes that you would have assigned to it. So if you're using clay on concrete to make your visual art, how can you use language to give a similar effect of what clay and concrete feels like, right? And of course, you are all the writers in the room, so you, of course, are going to have brilliant solutions to this by using evocative words, by replacing something like the word painting with a word like laying mortar, or scribbling, or bleeding. You know, like, I'm thinking of like vastly different ways that you could describe an act of painting that isn't so banal and almost meaningless as the word painting. Like, what does it actually look like when you paint? So verbs, and again, all of you are writers, right? So I feel slightly sheepish doing this. I know, like, each of us has our own area of expertise, and so I hope to bring my knowledge of visual art to your writing. But I also know that probably everyone in this virtual room knows to be thinking about verbs and nouns first, right? And to really let each of those words really have power. And then only when necessary, use things like adjectives and adverbs to add more context to what you're writing. But as an example, I was fairly proud of a statement that I wrote for my most recent show, because it was very short. Really, the first sentence was just about like logistics. So the statement is 2 sentences. Series of oil portraits pressed between panes of plexiglass, taking a close look at the presidents of the United States. You'll notice that I didn't have to go into a long description to tell you how the things were made or what they look like, because you actually kind of get it from choice words, right? And then I add some context at the end by saying their likenesses are flattened and distorted, a tender violence done to all things captured as an image or written into history, right? So again, tender is it modifies violence, but for the most part, I'm trying my best to rely on the action words here to convey the essence of what I'm doing in the art, right? So I could do the same for writing. And I guess I didn't mention this in the beginning. I am a writer also sometimes. I write mostly about art, but also write poetry sometimes, but look to all of you as the real experts in the room. So I would be really curious if any of you are ready and willing, if you can pull a sentence or a phrase from what you've revised here as I've been sort of talking at you, from what you've written, and put it in the chat and see what we're coming up with here. I want to see the language. Okay, we're being shy again, so that's okay. I approached this workshop with like college teaching where I can force people to participate, but with also the knowledge that you're all like adults and you don't have to participate in the chat if you don't want to. So I was emotionally prepared for that. But seriously, think about the physicality of writing, right? Think about the way the language feels when you say the words, because people, when they read the language, they also can envision themselves speaking it. And if there's lots of repetitive consonants, then it feels differently than if there's lots of long drawn out vowels, right? Think about all of these physical aspect things. I have a couple questions, but I'm gonna offer one more sort of exercise that you can do on your own, perhaps after this is over. But another exercise is to think of Jenny Holzer. She's the artist who did these truisms. These inheritance must be abolished, money creates tastes, morals are for little people. These truisms that she wrote. Take that statement that you wrote about your own practice of whatever it is that you make and do. What happens if you try and boil it down to a Jenny Holzer truism? A single sentence or less. A phrase that just captures the essence of what you do. I often find that this is an excellent exercise, not only in creating writing about work, it's also a really good exercise for the work itself. Either in my writing or in my visual art, I do find sometimes that it's easy, it's tempting to over-explain, to be heavy-handed, right? What happens if you step back and imagine what you're doing in its most boiled down essential form? So in writing, a Jenny Holzer truism, what would that phrase be? And I'm gonna take us to a link while we move on perhaps to a Q&A. Let's see. These are some of Jenny Holzer's truisms that can just sort of go on in the background. Oh, good, I'm seeing some. Other words in other worlds. Your story matters as much as mine, ours. Acknowledging fear is a privilege. Chisel away at a slate with my fingertips and tongue. Wow. These, yeah, searching for the metaphor that makes connection between the things disconnected. This is awesome. And this is that's what I had for you tonight, was to just show you the way that artists have dealt with text and have brought text into physical form to help us think about text that lives outside of the body and how it takes on a physical mode of being, and how thinking about how text might exist outside of ourselves as an object or an image or something that takes up space or is held in a pocket, how that can actually help us come back to the writing itself and think, how else could this exist just a little better? If it feels like it should live in my pocket, how should the writing itself change so that it feels like it should live in my pocket? If it feels like it should be painted on the side of a building, how can the language itself change so that it feels like it should be on the side of a building, right? And with that, I'll give it over to Haley and see if there's if she wants to pick out a couple of questions.
All right, thank you so much. That was wonderful. I really appreciate you talking about especially the idea of the thing on the page and how it's not necessarily the thing itself, but it draws us to the image of the thing. Frequently in like writing class, we talk about the signified and the signifier and what exactly we create to attach the name of the thing to the object. That's wonderful. We did have a question. Let's see. How do you keep up with current art news? I feel that all poets should be reading about art more and thinking more about our bodies' mark making.
Well, it's sort of natural for me because I'm in it all the time. But I would say for somebody who wants to start becoming abreast of art news, I would subscribe to newsletters such as Hyperallergic. I feel is one that's presented in a way that's like contextualized nicely for people who don't have like a degree in art history. I feel like Hyperallergic is very good at that. If you really want to dig deep and like read some real critical writing about art, Art Forum is a great place. The magazine is a little bit expensive, but worth it if you really want to do some good reading. And Freeze, not Freeze, I'll spell it, spelled like that. Freeze is another really good one. And another thing to do is, if you're a social media person, you can go on Instagram and follow some of the institutions that you think are doing good work. I also recommend, if you're going to follow some institutions, and by institutions, I mean like, art museums. So we have like Mass MoCA, the Hearst Museum, like all the museums around the whole country. But if you're going to be thinking about museums and how art is presented there, I also highly recommend following, put it in the chat here. Change the Museum is an Instagram handle that really digs into some of the structural inequalities in museums. So, whenever we look to museums for our knowledge, or our history textbooks for our knowledge, we're dealing with a canon that has a long history of supremacy, like white supremacy, right? So as you continue to follow all these things, follow them skeptically, and then once Instagram knows that you're interested in art, it'll hopefully start showing you some more grassroots art organizations. You can, of course, start by following Vinegar, which is a nonprofit that I co-direct here in Birmingham. But there are smaller art spaces across the country and the world that are doing work with sort of underrepresented artists. They're showing art that's being made in real time for real issues in real places. Thank you, Sophia. Yeah, so that's my recommendation. Couple of good email news digests and a couple of good social media follows.
Great, thank you. Can you talk a little bit more about your work with Vinegar and about Vinegar's work within the community?
Sure, yeah. So I am from Alabama originally, but I moved away for a few years for grad school and whatnot. And then I came back and I saw that Birmingham had exploded while I was gone, but was sure that there would be a proportional explosion of the number of art spaces in town with that cultural explosion. But I was interested and curious to see that actually the number of art spaces had not increased proportionate to the bars and restaurants and the rest. It's like, well, that's interesting. And I also, had been in graduate school and had seen all this like weird art and loved it, and like really like art that's sort of unconventional, that doesn't take the typical form. I also love painting and sculpture. I love art, but I became so accustomed to seeing things like installation and video art and whatnot that I wanted to see more of that here. And there weren't really spaces dedicated to the sort of out of the box stuff. So I connected with another artist who sort of sees some similar aspirations as me, Ann Tronson. And we started as an art collective, and sooner than later we formed a nonprofit board, and now we have a space. We had a grand opening right before COVID. So we've tried to find a way to be back in the community with COVID safety precautions. But our interest for the community is multifold, like many different aspects. One is we just want to inspire people. Like I've seen art that has shaken me, has inspired me, has moved me, and I want to give other people that experience. But I also want to be a platform for artists, because what we offer is a situation, a context, and then the artist comes in and it's their voice that really is being amplified. And so giving artists an opportunity to share their voice, figuratively and sometimes literally, with the community feels like a really important service. And so the number one motto of Vinegar is to champion artists.
I love that. Where'd the name come from?
Well, when we were first an artist collective, we decided we needed a band name. And so a friend of Ann's was like a band guy and sent list of like 300 different potential band names, most of which were ridiculous, like Mommy, Daddy, Sister, Brother was one of my favorite ridiculous ones. But among the ridiculous ones, there are some like really good ones, and Vinegar just kept coming to the top, and we were like, that's just so good. And we realized there's a process of fermentation, that there's growth and change, and it's like the process of growth actually changes the substance in which that growth and fermentation is happening. And so that's a nice metaphor for art. And like cooking metaphors, like you can have a really delicious dish and then you add just like a little splash of vinegar and it just takes it to the next level. So all the right ingredients are there. You just need a little splash of vinegar. So we like those metaphors.
Oh, I love a metaphor, right?
Yeah.
Okay, does anyone else have any questions for Melissa? You can drop it in the chat, or you're more than welcome at this point to unmute yourself and ask her directly.
I just wanted to sort of self-reflect a bit and see if it resonates with other writers, that I think the reason the exercise in creating the visual statement was difficult for me is because I'm currently going through that process of thinking about how to like visualize words. I think when you see the world in words, like literally, like you see something happening in front of you and you think of the words that you would put to that. And when you also feed yourself the truth or untruth that it's the domain of others to be responsible for visuals and how we sort of consume those, that it's really difficult to, I think people find this difficult in the writing communities as well, to even switch genres, to go from like saying I'm a poet to a fiction writer to a nonfiction writer. And so it's even harder to sort of make that leap to say, I can transmit what I see in words into a visual space. And that's been a really, in terms of what I've been working on recently, that's been a really boundary spanning and sort of liberating process, but it is very much a process.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, Brandy, that's actually not dissimilar from the experience that artists have when we try to take what we've done visually and put it into words. So I can very much relate. And, you know, as an educator too, I see that a lot. Like I often want to be like, it's so clear to me that you're making work about this, but I can't do that because it's that process of discovering that link that is key, but it is very hard. And I think, you know, each of us has our own way of processing the world that's a little bit different than everyone else. Some of us are more tactile, some are more verbal, some are more visual. And it's sort of hard to switch gears sometimes. But I found it personally very beneficial. And I don't think that I would be making the work that I do if I didn't sometimes sit down and write it out. So I appreciate all of you going on that little journey with me.
Right, so I'm taken back to your comments that you had earlier about the international art English, right? And I think so frequently, within myself, but also within my students, we see them reaching towards like what's expected, what they think is expected of them in writing, right? So sometimes I wind up with their writing or their essays that's just filled with this sort of academic language, and it doesn't make sense because they think they're giving me what they want, what I want, but really I have no idea what they're saying, and they don't really either. And so when we kind of like distill it down to the voice, like, no, simplify it. What's your voice? Don't give me the big words. What are you actually doing here? What are you trying to say when we start there and then go from there? You know, that's where the real magic happens, right? So thank you for having us reflect on what we're doing as writers and like what we intend to do with our writing and how that's received by others, but most importantly, like what we're doing with it with ourselves. All right, any other questions, guys?
Shelley, did you have a question? Okay, it was good to see you.
All right, great.
Hey, I just wanted to say, this was super helpful, actually. It really made me think a lot. And just, Melissa, writers, I don't know if you're around writers a lot, like when we're quiet, that's a good thing. You know? It means that we're thinking. So it was really, really helpful to me. I just haven't generated it all yet.
I'm really grateful to hear that. Thank you. And again, my experiences with students. So I'll tell you what I tell my students is that like, I always appreciate feedback, positive or negative, because it helps to know. So I'm really grateful to hear that. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Melissa, for being here tonight with us and for all your wonderful work. Thank you, participants, for showing up to the workshop. So we do have back-to-back workshops tomorrow night at 6 p.m. We will have Randy Pink on, and then at 7 we will have Lauren Goodwin Slaughter. Hold on to your Zoom links because the same Zoom link that you used tonight will also be active tomorrow. So thank you guys all for coming, and I'll see you guys then, right? So thank you.
Thank you, Haley, and thank you, everyone. It's been an honor.
Bye.